establishment to defend Australia and our national interests. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Admiral. Now, on that note, I'm going to hand over to Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary and Admiral, for those opening statements, and you won't be surprised to know that I have some follow-up questions about the PLA and task group. And so, Admiral, I might direct them to you in the first instance. You said in your opening statement that as of this morning, the task group is roughly 252 kilometres from Hobart. I assume that means they remain inside Australia's exclusive economic zone. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you have any update on your belief about their intended route?
Senator, of course, that's a question the Chinese can most authoritatively answer.
Yes.
We have been monitoring them and drawing assessments on what path they may take. At various times, the task group has avoided weather or conducted its own training, which has led to possibilities that it could have gone further east in the Tasman Sea, could have turned back north, as previous task groups have done. But the fact that they are currently south of Hobart and proceeding southwest suggests that it is more likely now that they may proceed through the Australian Bight.
Right. Andrew Green and Stephen Jedgetts from the ABC have reported this morning that quote-unquote military officials believe it's likely that the task group is being accompanied by a nuclear submarine. Does Defence have a view on whether that's likely or not?
I don't know whether there is a submarine with them. It is possible. Task groups occasionally do deploy with submarines, but not always. So I can't be definitive on whether that's the case.
Okay. I want to go back to the start of this expedition. When did Defence first become aware of the task group's formation to the northeast of Australia?
We have been monitoring the movement of the task group through its transit through Southeast Asia. And we have observed the task group as it has come south through that region. We are aware that the task group split into two components, one of which came down to the west of Papua and into Australia's northern waters. The other component of the task group proceeded to the east of Papua New Guinea before they came together in the Coral Sea to the southeast of Papua New Guinea. So we have had an awareness of their movement, and from the point of time where the first of the vessels entered into our more immediate region, we have been conducting active surveillance of their activities.
Can you be more specific when you say entered our immediate region and when that surveillance commenced?
So the frigate, which was the westerly of the two components of the task group before they came together, it entered the Arafura Sea on Monday the 10th of February.
Okay, and our surveillance commenced from that, our active surveillance commenced from that point?
Yes.
And continues today?
Yes, in cooperation with other partners. New Zealand has been public, but we have been working with a range of regional partners as part of that surveillance effort.
Has our active surveillance been continuous from when they first entered the Arafura Sea to now?
We have been maintaining awareness of them continuously, and certainly while the vessels have been closer to Australian waters, there has been an active either sea or air presence as part of it. The task group has moved, at a period of time, moved well out into the Tasman. New Zealand picked up a shadowing activity as part of that with a New Zealand frigate, and New Zealand P8 aircraft have also, between the cooperation between the two nations and using all the means available to us, we have actively monitored the movement of those vessels.
It sounds like from your answer, though, that our own active surveillance has not been continuous. There have been times which we've handed off to other partners like the New Zealanders. So there's been breaks in our surveillance along the way.
So if your question is, have we always had an Australian aircraft
Correct.
or ship? We have cooperated with New Zealand to share that based on the best disposition of military platforms at the time, and consistent with our planning of, depending on what the task group did, of making sure that we had assets best placed to cover off on different options depending on where they proceeded.
Okay. When was the Minister for Defence and Deputy Prime Minister first notified?
Of the movement of the task group into our borders?
Correct. I'll get more specific on the live firing exercise next, but just initially on the movement of the task group.
I'll just invite others to join me on those details, Senator.
Senator, Hugh Jeffrey, Deputy Secretary, Strategy, Policy, Industry. We provided advice to the government on or around the date of it entering into the RFERC, and I think it's around about the 11th of February, but we can get the date for you precisely.
Okay.
Bernard Phillip, First Assistant Secretary, International Policy. We provided formal advice to the Deputy Prime Minister's office on the 7th of February.
7th, okay. And how often have you been briefing the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister or his office since then?
We've provided daily updates.
Daily updates, thank you. When did Defence become aware that the task group was intending to travel southward along the Australian coast?
Senator, as I indicated, the task group disaggregated and then split into two components, with the westerly of those two components travelling east through the Torres Strait. They then came together to the southeast of Papua New Guinea. The task groups have done that previously, and some have proceeded out into the southwest Pacific. Some have proceeded back north. So we were evaluating as that task group came together and monitoring their activities. It would be a more conclusive definition as in the days that followed that as they started to proceed further south.
At what time did the PLA enter into waters they've never before done? You said they've come further south than they ever have before. On what date did they cross that threshold?
So I can be just clear on that answer. Of course, the PLA has had ships that have transited to the south of Australia previously. They've done that in 2019. So that they're not currently doing something that we have not seen in terms of Chinese vessel presence to the south of Australia or on the eastern coast of our country. What is different with this one is in the past, vessels that have done it have either been returning from counter-piracy patrols conducted in the western side of the Indian Ocean and have come through this. What is more peculiar in terms of, or particular in the case of this task group, is it has come directly from the Southeast Asia into Australian waters. So the task group has now gone further south than we have seen PLA vessels before. In the last Talisman Sabre in 2023, we had a Chinese intelligence collection vessel that came well south in the proximity of Sydney. So we've seen Chinese vessels in our waters to the east and south of the country previously, but just not in the form that we're currently observing.
Have Chinese vessels ever entered Australia's exclusive economic zone on our east coast like this previously?
Possibly, Senator. I would think we'd have to go back, including particularly the intelligence collection vessel back in 2023. So we could relook at the path as we understood it. So it is possible that's the case.
I'd be grateful if you could provide that update today if possible. Obviously, if questions are taken on notice today and an election is called soon, the Parliament will be prorogued and questions on notice effectively won't get answered in a timely way. So if it can be provided today, that would be appreciated. How many Australian Navy ships are involved in shadowing the task group?
So I would just be considered in the way I answer that question, because I don't wish to give away our disposition or our planning for how we will continue to respond. But I can happily indicate we've had 2 different vessels of our own that have changed in and out. We have additional vessels available to us depending on the movement of this task group in order to maintain that active surveillance pattern. The New Zealand frigate has been involved, as I'd mentioned, with aircraft from both 2 countries. But if I could answer your question in part by saying I'm very confident we have the capabilities to maintain that presence. We have strong availability of different platforms of a variety of natures to be able to achieve that effect.
Can you say what class the Australian ships were?
The 2 frigates that have so far done it have been Anzac-class frigates.
Thank you. Have we been using P8 aircraft or other RAF aircraft to monitor the task group?
Yes.
Which aircraft?
P8s.
Any others?
No.
Okay. Thank you. You've already spoken about coordination with our New Zealand friends. When did Defence first become aware of the task group's intention to conduct a live fire exercise?
So Defence became aware through, so there were 2 reporting means. Perhaps if I could step through the circumstances with the first of the high sea firing events. There were 2 reporting paths. There has been public commentary on this. One clearly from a civil aircraft that heard the radio call that the Chinese vessels were making to provide in the indication of what they were intending to conduct. A New Zealand frigate operating in the vicinity of that task group as part of the shadowing activities also heard that radio call, so the communication pathway for that messaging went both through a civil air services and air traffic control approach, as well as it did through military reporting chains from the New Zealand frigate then into our Australian military system.
Okay, so you kind of answered my subsequent question, but still not clearly my first question, and I want to explore that in more detail, and I know Senator McKenzie will want to as well. So my question actually was when, not how. When did Defence first learn of the activity?
We were first notified of it by Air Services on the morning of the event.
Right. Senator McKenzie will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Air Services has testified that they learnt from a Virgin pilot and that they were notified half an hour after the commencement of the live firing exercise. Does that mean Defence first learned of it only via Air Services Australia and Virgin half an hour after it commenced?
So I think just to be clear, and I'm not entirely sure of the characterisation of what the Virgin aircraft heard, whether that was the firing window, so the part of the security call that I understand the Chinese vessels indicated a firing window. So that would be normal practice. I think for the event on that Friday morning, we understand the Chinese were advising a firing window from 9:30 till 3 p.m. I'm using Canberra time, if I may, Senator, for it. So the Virgin aircraft may have heard it inside the firing window, but that may not have been at the time that the vessels were conducting the firing.
Yes, but so as I understand it, Air Services Australia told Senator McKenzie on Monday night that the Virgin pilot reported to Air Services Australia at 9:58 a.m. The firing window, as you say, commenced at 9:30.
Yes.
So is it the case that Defence was only notified via Virgin and Air Services Australia 28 minutes after the firing window commenced?
Yes.
Right. So this is an important development because the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister and others have said that either that the notification from our Chinese friends was not adequate or not sufficient, but it actually seems, in fact, there was no notification at all prior to the commencement of the firing exercise.
So, to our knowledge, the notification was that call that had made from when the firing window opened, and that, in our view, is inadequate notification as well.
That's not inadequate, it's after it started.
Well, that's when the civil aircraft heard the call. We can't be definitive on whether there was a call made by the Chinese vessels earlier than that. So, as I'm sure, Senator, you appreciate, aircraft operate with the range of their radios depend on where the aircraft is and where the transmitter is. So there may have been earlier calls made from the vessels that the Virgin aircraft had not heard.
I understand that, but What's the value of a notification if it's not received, if it's not heard? The government's been very clear that the notification was not timely, that it should have been earlier. But you're now telling me that notification was not received, at least, by Defence, by Australia, until after it commenced. That's not any notification at all, is it?
No.
Okay. Well, that's contrary to the evidence that the Prime Minister and other senior ministers have given publicly. Minister, can you account for the discrepancy here?
I think the government has been very clear that the notification fell short of expectations. It is our practice, and officials can speak to this, to provide 24 to 48 hours of notice for live fire exercises, to allow other affected parties to manage safety issues and to conduct planning. That did not occur in this case. The formal requirements are less than that, but this does fall short of best practice, and it falls short of the practice that we expect of our own, of the ADF. Officials may wish to add to that.
So, Senator, our expectation is that while the international practice requires vessels on the high seas to advise of their activity and take measures to ensure the safety of a firing event would occur, our view of best practice is that they are forewarned. In the Australian Flight Information Region, we would provide 48 hours notice in order to minimise that disruption, and perhaps equal or more importantly is our practice is that you do not conduct firings near international air lanes or major shipping lanes.
Yes.
And we retain our firing zones well clear of those areas, which significantly mitigates the risk to commercial or other traffic.
And I am keen to come back to that very important distinction you've drawn between our conduct and their conduct, because some people have compared our conduct to their conduct, and I'd be interested in exploring that with you subsequently. But just to be clear, had it not been the case that a Virgin commercial airliner had been in the area, picked up that radio report and referred it to Air Services Australia, how long would it have taken for us to know that this live firing exercise was taking place?
The advice through the New Zealand vessel on station, through its national and reporting, we received it at 11:01 of the morning. That is approximately 50 minutes or somewhat less than an hour since that advice came to us from Air Services.
So, but 90 minutes after the window commenced for the live firing exercise.
That we here knew, but of course the important notification is to vessels and aircraft operating in the proximity of the activity.
Well, that's one important, but it's also important that you know too, isn't it?
It's critical that platforms in
Indeed.
the area know, because they are the ones that would be at risk if it was not well conducted.
So just to clarify, it's not really notification of an upcoming exercise if we only find out about it after it's commenced, is it?
But the notification, Senator, is to those platform aircraft ships that are operating in the area. So that's the requirement that has to be satisfied, and why we hold the view that that notification was inadequate.
But it's not really inadequate. It just wasn't given. We weren't provided any notification, because notification is something that happens prior to something starting, not afterwards.
I think, Senator, you may be misunderstanding the nature of the obligation.
Please assist me.
Well, the officials can talk you through it, but the obligation is around providing notification so that aircraft operating in that area may adjust their activities to maintain safety.
That's the bare minimum, Minister.
That is the bare minimum. That is the international law. The government has additionally been concerned that it does not meet best practice. And there are two benchmarks here. There is what is legal, and then there is best practice. We don't consider this meets best practice, and we've been very clear about that, that 24 hours notice, which we would expect in terms of notice to airmen, has not occurred, and it's on that basis that we have raised that with China.
Or, in fact, any notice. Sorry, were you going to add something to that, Admiral?
The Senator's characterisation is right, that, as I have said, the requirement is that firing vessels notify of their activity that does not specify a pre-notification period, and that they take active steps to manage the safety of aircraft or vessels in the proximity of the firing.
So at the time of the incident, it was New Zealand which had responsibility for monitoring the ships, is that correct?
The New Zealand ship was in the proximity, yes.
Yeah. And at what point did we take responsibility for monitoring the exercise?
The New Zealand ship remained with that live firing, or with the Chinese task group, through both the Friday and the Saturday when the second event occurred. I don't propose to indicate when we have switched vessels in and out. That's part of our planning of how to respond in the circumstance that we have, but it was the New Zealand frigate that was there for both the Friday and the Saturday.
How did a Virgin commercial aircraft pick up this before our New Zealand friends did, if they were monitoring it?
But I don't know whether that is the case that they did. What I indicated was the reporting pathway is quite different. So an aircraft has immediate access through air traffic control to report an incident of that nature, who then directly communicate it to Air Services Australia. It's as air safety should be, it's a very direct and well-practiced pathway. Concurrently, the military reporting chain would have moved through the New Zealand reporting system and then into providing advice to Australia. So they both be heard at the same time, but the means of reporting them is always going to be more direct through an aircraft to an air traffic control service.
But the impression you've given me before is that we were sharing responsibility with our New Zealand partners for monitoring the movement of this task group, that it was kind of seamlessly interchanged between us, that we were talking and communicating all the time. How is it that it was an hour quicker to find out via a commercial plane that there was a live firing exercise than with one of our closest security partners, whom we're engaged in a joint mission of monitoring this activity?
Because, as I explained, Senator, the pathway for an aircraft is very direct and immediate. The pathway for an event which was an indication of a high seas firing occurring through the military command chain had more steps involved in it than the pathway for an aircraft reporting to an air traffic control service.
An hour and 3 minutes longer? I mean, shouldn't it be much quicker than that? Shouldn't it be as quick as a commercial pilot is able to do so?
But it's perhaps only 2 calls for a commercial pilot to do it. The military reporting system for an event of this nature will generally lag the pace of reporting that you could do with an immediate radio call from an aircraft.
I think that would be a great surprise to most ordinary Australians if they're watching this. They would think that it would be direct and immediate through military reporting channels, and that if we were monitoring a task group of another nation in our region with our closest partners, that notification would be much prompter than that. We wouldn't be relying on commercial airliners to report incredibly important safety information.
The commercial airlines, on a matter that is of direct interest and impact to them, have a very immediate reporting pathway. The military reporting line would have recognised that this is a high seas firing event and was noteworthy of reporting, but the immediacy of it would have been different to the 2 platform types.
Why didn't one of our P8s pick this up and report it earlier?
Because it wasn't proximate to the firing at the time.
Right. Did New Zealand have air assets in the area?
Not at the time of the firing, no.
Right. Thank you, Chair. If an Australian frigate was in the area observing this, would the reporting have been more immediate?
It would have had less steps involved in it, so yes, I would have expected that it would have been more immediate.
How much?
That's a difficult question.
It's a professional judgment in your experience.
Well, it's a hypothetical.
I would have expected it to have come through our reporting. I think the only definitive answer I could give, Senator, it would have taken less time than when you have to go through another nation's reporting system as well.
Okay, I know the Chair's trying to chair the call.
Thanks very much, Senator Patterson. Senator SHOEBRIDGE, you have the call.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Admiral Johnson and all for attending today. I do find it hard to understand how it takes longer to get a report from our probably our closest friend, through their military channels than it does through a Virgin pilot and civil aviation authorities. How long did it take for us to get the notification from the New Zealand Defence Force?
So I'd said, Senator, 1101 was when we in Defence received the advice.
So, have you spoke? Was that because of a delay in New Zealand from communicating to Australia? Do we know when they found out?
I don't have the time when New Zealand found out.
Did you ask?
We can find the answer, Senator. I think what I have done is recognising the importance of passage of information to just make sure between our two national systems that events of these are reported as expeditiously as the circumstances warrant.
Well, did New Zealand advise when the live firing commenced?
On the Friday, the live firing itself was not physically observed. So what they reported was listening to the radio call from the Chinese task group, but they did not observe the firing, which would have been, we expect, was from gunnery systems, guns off the ships, which you would have to hear or see directly to be aware that it was firing.
So they also received the call that it was about the window rather than the fact.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Do you know when they picked up the call about the window?
I don't have that time, but we can find it.
You see, when I look at the budget papers, they show that Defence had a record budget last year of, I think, $55.7 billion. They say that Navy, for its personnel and expenditure, got $10.7 billion, in addition to, I think, about 40% of the capital budget. And the first time you're tested, really, in our anything close to territorial waters, we send out two 30-year-old Anzac frigates which don't identify anything. I'm trying to work out how it is with a $55.7 billion budget, we find out from a Virgin pilot and a delayed notification from New Zealand. How does that happen?
So, Senator, I think I've explained the reporting from an aircraft is different from the reporting that would occur from a military vessel in the proximity of it. I don't agree with your characterisation. The vessels are capable. They provided the responsiveness that we've needed. We've been able to maintain the level of surveillance that is appropriate for the movement of these vessels in our waters. And I continue to have both the air and naval assets available to continue to do so.
Well, the naval assets that were sent were two Anzac-class frigates.
No, Senator, I said those were the two that have actively been shadowing. I have also said that we had additional capabilities put in place depending on what the future movement of that task group may have been. It is possible that it would have turned further into Tasman, that it may have returned back to the north, to transit back up to our northern eastern waters. So we made sure that we had options available to us depending on what we observed the task group performing.
Well, why don't we look at what options were available? I put to you that there's a record defence budget in terms of quantum this year. Was that right? $55.7 billion? Is that a record?
Our budget is growing year by year.
Yep. And the allocation to the Navy is also a record high in terms of both capital and personnel and other capabilities. It's a record high for the Navy.
There is significant investment into our maritime capabilities, yes.
And your evidence today is that the Navy has, and I think I'll quote you, strong availability of different platforms.
Yes.
Yep. Well, let's talk about the availability of the different platforms. In terms of the surface combat fleet, how many Anzac frigates are currently available or ready for deployment.
I'll invite Chief of Navy who will join us, Senator, but we will be cautious on the level of detail that indicates our operational capability. So Chief of Navy might talk to the general availability of our platforms while being careful of how detailed he characterises it.
I will also remind you, Senator SHOEBRIDGE, that the Greens political party had an opportunity to vote in favour of a forum, a joint statutory committee on defence that would have provided a forum in which you could have had a classified discussion, but that you refused to do so.
Yeah, which you would have excluded the Greens from.
You voted against it.
We voted against another major party secret stitch-up. So let's move on to where we actually have a public forum. Admiral Hammond, I think one of the Anzac frigates has been retired. I think the Anzac frigate's been retired. 2 are on their way out of service. And I think 6 are undergoing upgrade. Is that right?
Senator, good morning, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, Chief of Navy. That's not correct, Senator.
All right.
There is one Anzac class frigate.
Sorry, Vice Admiral, just trying to get your microphone working. Yep, okay, good eye.
So one Anzac class frigate has been decommissioned. That was HMAS Anzac. She is in the process of disposal at Henderson Shipyard at the moment, and that process involves harvesting spare parts to seed the supply chain for the remaining 7. Defence has an authority to consider decommissioning a second Anzac class frigate next year. Consistent with my previous testimony, that'll be subject to a conditions-based assessment on the fleet and juxtaposed against the cost of ownership and the need to keep her in service. So that is a decision that has not yet been taken. Of the 7 Anzac class frigates currently in service, 6 are fully crewed. I would characterise the availability of the Anzac class frigate as being at a bit of a high point. I'm very pleased with the capability at the moment. It's met all the requirements of this particular activity and others, and we've sustained another surface combatant deployed during this period. I'd also highlight that the Anzac class frigates are being fitted with the Naval Strike Missile capability. So notwithstanding the age of the hull, we've conducted a lot of sustainment and maintenance on these ships. They are still world-class Tier 2 surface combatants, Senator.
Well, I mean, the Defence Minister, Minister Miles, last year described the Anzacs as in a, and I'll quote, deteriorating state. He was mistaken, was he?
No, Senator, the ships are getting older. That is true. We spend money maintaining the ships. We replace components in the ships in order to keep them as high-end seagoing platforms, and this activity has demonstrated again the responsiveness of the capability.
Okay, so of the 7 Anzac frigates that are still in commission, 1 is not crewed, and 6 are available, and they are now, the minimum age of those vessels is 21 years, but some of them are getting on to 30 years of age. Is that right?
I think the oldest one is in its late 20s, Senator. The Anzac class frigate that is not crewed is in deep maintenance at Henderson with BAE at the moment, part of the AMCAP program.
Then just remaining in the surface combat fleets, there are the 3 Hobart air warfare destroyers. There was a recently published on the AusTender website extension of the maintenance contract with Lockheed for the, I think it was the upgrade of the Aegis combat system. Why has that been extended?
Senator, I'll ask my colleagues from Navy Shipbuilding Sustainment Group to speak to the specifics, but this is related to the Aegis combat system, which is the brains, if you like, of the warship. And we have a spiral upgrade program for combat systems in the Navy.
Yep. But that's been a long-standing contract with Lockheed. I'm asking why it was extended and also what the cost of the extension is.
Cheryl Lutz, First Assistant Secretary, Major Service Combatant Combat System. The contract has been extended to support Aegis Baseline 8, which is the current Aegis combat management system on the air warfare destroyers. We need to maintain that system until we upgrade to Baseline 9 during the DDG capability enhancement period.
So is this because of a delay in the upgrade?
No, it's not a delay in the upgrade. We always plan to maintain the Baseline 8 ships until we replace them with Baseline 9.
What's the cost of the Lockheed extension contract?
I'll take that on notice.
All right. So, Vice Admiral Hammond, does that in any way affect the availability of the 3 Hobart air warfare destroyers?
Senator, no. The availability of 3 air warfare destroyers continues to meet our preparedness requirements.
And so of the 3, can you tell me what the availability of those, the Hobart, the Brisbane and Sydney are?
Senator, this is one of those areas that I'm not going to go into specifics on, the operational disposition and readiness of the Royal Australian Navy fleet. Suffice to say that if you look at the last 12 months, we've had HMAS Hobart conduct several regional presence deployments. We've had HMAS Sydney do similar, as well as live missile firings as part of exercise RIMPAC, and we've had Brisbane deployed to the west coast of the United States to conduct a Tomahawk first-class missile. So all 3 ships have been available for their planned deployment windows, and again, Brisbane returned home on the 6th of January this year and Hobart deployed on the 6th of January. Overall, I'm really pleased with the availability of the air warfare destroyer program.
And then we found out last night from the ASC that 3 of the 6 Collins-class submarines are in one form or other of either deep or intermediate maintenance. Does that mean there are 3 Collins-class submarines available, or is it because there were concerning reports at the end of last year that only 1 was available?
Senator, there are 3 submarines in the custody of the Royal Australian Navy right now.
All right. In the custody of the Royal Australian Navy, but that's different for being actually deployable assets.
Senator, the disposition, the operational disposition and readiness of the Royal Australian Navy fleet is something that I'm not prepared to go into further detail on for security reasons.
All right. So we have 6 Anzac frigates, 3 Collins-class submarines that are all 30 years plus of age, and we have the 3 air warfare destroyers. Secretary Moriarty, the Navy has been given a record budget now for a number of years. There are repeated statements that from the ADF's perspective, we need to be ready for significant potential conflict with a 5-year window. Under your stewardship, in the last 12 months, you've accepted a single offshore patrol vessel, which is not commissioned and not ready for service. When are you intending, with that record budget, to add a single vessel to the surface fleet, the surface warfighting warships fleet? When are you scheduled to add one?
So, Senator, the recapitalisation of the Royal Australian Navy has been a priority for the government, and it's devoted resources to that. Shipbuilding is a time-consuming process. The government has placed orders for vessels and is taking forward the Hunter-class frigate project, the offshore patrol vessels, as the Chief of Navy said, the upgrades to the DDGs. So there is an active program of work going on to grow the capability of the Royal Australian Navy.
So can you remind me what the original target date was for the delivery of the first Hunter-class frigate? Vice Admiral Hammond, perhaps you know.
The delivery of the first Hunter-class frigate was originally planned for around 2029, 2030.
I beg your pardon?
2029, 2030.
How much is the current budget for the Hunter-class frigates?
Current approved budget is 27 point something billion. I'll get that for you.
And what is the current estimated date that a Hunter-class frigate will actually be in commission, the first?
2032.
All right. And
Current budget is 27.05 billion, MyEFO 24-25.
so we have a current $27 billion budget for the primary addition to our surface combat fleet, and the arrival date has slipped from 2029 to 2032. That's 7 years from now. Vice Admiral Hammond, in 7 years' time, we may get one Hunter-class frigate. Is there a program in place to keep the Anzac frigates afloat for the next 7 years?
Senator, Vice Admiral Hammond, Chief of Navy. There's a couple of programs, and the characterisation of a float, I don't necessarily agree with. We have maintained these ships as high-end warfighting platforms, hence the increased investment in the ships as they've become a little bit older. There are 2 frigate programs underway right now. We're talking, you're specifically asking questions about the Hunter-class frigate program, which I'm comfortable is now on schedule with its revised program. The other one is the C3000 General Purpose Frigate program, which we're due back to government in the middle of the year on. That is the program of record which we anticipate to take over the heavy lifting from the Anzac-class frigate, and ideally before the end of the decade, subject to further government decisions. But at the moment, I'm very comfortable with the resilience and performance of the Anzac-class frigate capability. We are spending more money on it than we did when it was younger. That is the cost of ownership that comes with operating a professional Navy. But at the moment, yes, Senator, I'm very comfortable with the transition plan, and the ships will not just be sitting idle. We'll continue to invest in them until they are relieved on the line.
Last minute.
We'll come back to the general purpose frigates and the state at which that program is later. When you say ideally that might produce a ship, the first ship before the end of this decade, is there do you have a date for the first ship? And do we know how many ships are going to be delivered on the current budget?
That program is still subject to government decision.
So to be clear, with all of this record spending, record for the Navy, eating up about 80% of the capital budget for the ADF, we may get a Hunter-class frigate 1 in 2032, and the best we can hear about the future general purpose frigates is ideally we might get one before the end of the decade. Is that the current state?
Sorry, Jim McDowell, Deputy Secretary, Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment. So the competition for the general purpose frigate is still on foot. The delivery dates that we are requiring from the remaining bidders is 2029 for the at the latest.
One.
Not necessarily for one. It is not necessary. I don't know how you know it's one, Senator. How
Will
do
you tell
know?
me how many it's going to be?
It's up to the bidders
Oh,
what they can bid. If they
you
can
don't
bid,
even
if they can, excuse me, you asked
even
the
guarantee
question.
what?
I'm allowed to answer.
Thank you, Senator
I think I'm
Shoebridge.
allowed to answer.
Thank you. Just let the witness answer, and then we'll have to move the call around.
It is up to the
Jim,
bidders
you've got the call.
to bid the best possible dates that they can. It is likely that they will make a calculation that if they can bid more boats, more ships before that date, that they will do that. So I don't know, because we have not yet received the final bids, and it would be silly for me to speculate on what they might bid. But what I do know is that we have set a set of conditions in the bid that incentivises early delivery.
All right, well, we're going to come back to you
I think
later,
I don't
Senator
know is the
Shoebridge.
clearest
So
statement we've
Senator
had so
Green
far.
has the call. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Green. You've got the call.
Thank you, Chair. I have some questions about the ADF support that was provided during the North Queensland floods. CDF, thank you for your update in your opening statement about that work. I was really honoured to attend the RAF base there in Townsville with the Deputy Prime Minister, I think about a week ago. Time flies. And to say thank you to the personnel there on the base. But can you provide more information about what support exactly was provided to the Queensland Government during the floods?
Senator, good morning. Admiral David Johnson, Chief of the Defence Force. The Defence provided a number of different support, all, of course, subject to what Queensland Government sought, and then through our national emergency management arrangements, then conveyed to Defence. But the nature of support that we provided, it started with ground support to emergency services. It was a door knocking in order to make people aware in high risk and areas of the circumstances they were facing. So we worked with local authorities really to be able to improve the speed by which messaging could be passed by having more people out on the ground. As the circumstances of the flood evolved and the needs became clearer, our focus shifted to the helicopter support that might be needed. That was potentially required for the emergency movement of people, should that have been necessary. The nature of the support that we ended up providing, as my opening statement indicated, was largely moving essential cargo and goods to those communities or areas that had been isolated and needed some further support. We did that with Australian Defence aircraft. We were very grateful that the Singaporean CH-47s, their Chinooks, also assisted. Of course, they are Queensland. They operate from Oakey, so Queensland is important to them. So we provided the support that the helicopters for the movement of cargo, and then very importantly for those isolated communities, the temporary bridge arrangements, which is a capacity that resides within the Australian Army to be able to bridge, and in this case because of the damage to the bridge that was there, to enable at Ollers Creek movement of particularly vehicles with key supplies to the more emergency service vehicles to be able to cross the bridge and provide support to communities. So it was principally that the ability to cross flooded riverways, the support that we provided through helicopters, and our people on the ground who were both, of course, dealing with their own housing or personal circumstances while seeking to support their neighbours.
And I think you alluded to this, but in some sense with this event we had some warning about the weather that was going to occur, and were able to essentially prepare for what support might be needed. So Defence was there really on the ground from day one before the flooding started.
The proximity, particularly having the 3 Brigade in Townsville, provides us with a lot of flexibility and utility. As we did through the early period of summer, we worked very closely with Emergency Management Australia and with the states and territories to ensure that we are well placed to respond whatever circumstances may have required. So we did a lot of the preparation work with our emergency services, and the particulars for the North Queensland flooding meant that we had proximate capabilities that proved to be very helpful.
And you mentioned the Singaporean Armed Forces. How many helicopters and personnel did they have that were assisting?
Two helicopters.
So 2 aircraft. I will just check if we've got how many of their both aircrew and supporting services, but 2 aircraft that supported, that was very welcome. I think we've because of the nature of the flooding event, the scale and whether the continuing rains, it was certainly unclear to emergency management authorities the scale that that event may have expanded to. The provision of the Singaporean support just gave us additional capacity if that was to be required.
I think Defence, as I said, was there early on the ground, but provided support over almost 10 days altogether. The sheer scope and scale, I think, even for me, I was surprised about the amount of assistance, particularly flying hours, and the amount of pallets that were moved. Just to give other committee members a sense, do you know how much the helicopters transported, what that uplift was into Ingham particularly?
Yes, we do.
Yes, Senator. Rear Admiral Jonathan Earley, Head of Military Strategic Commitments. In terms of those rotor wing assets, they moved 90 personnel, 214,543 kilograms of cargo, which included 303 pallets in that, and 157 hours of flying time.
Thank you.
And I could add, Senator, 24 Singaporean Air Force personnel were involved in their support.
We're very grateful for their assistance. I know the chair's going to move me on soon, but we need to talk about the bridge, which has become its own sort of hero in this disaster. The support obviously was very welcome from the Queensland Government and from the community. Can you tell us a bit about that structure and the support that enabled it? As I understand, they essentially constructed that bridge in 7 hours once they were there at Alira Creek.
I might refer to the Chief of Army who
can
provide some insights.
Thanks.
Thanks, Senator. Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, Chief of Army. The bridge you're referring to is called a medium girder bridge. It's operated, constructed and deconstructed by our combat engineers, in this case the 3rd Combat Engineer Regiment in Townsville. It's a combat bridge, that is, its primary task is to be able to cross gaps and get a combat force against it, but obviously very useful in this sort of situation. It's rated to be able to take very heavy vehicles like tanks and other armoured vehicles, and was ideal in this situation. I think the point you make about its rapid deployment says much about the professionalism and the skill of our engineers.
Yep. Who I had the chance to meet some of them and thank them. It's a bit more complicated than an IKEA set, but they said that by the time you start putting it together, it becomes a very quick operation, but 7 hours is incredible to build a bridge. The one question I had was that obviously wasn't a permanent structure, it was a temporary bridge, but as I understand it, the purpose was to get emergency personnel, particularly the ergon trucks over into Ingham, particularly to restore power. That bridge is now being deconstructed, hasn't it?
That's correct. They're modular bridges that are designed to be able to be in place and then moved very quickly.
Thank you. It would, obviously I'm focusing on Queensland, but it would be remiss of me not to mention Tropical Cyclone Zelia in WA. Was ADF support on hand for that cyclone as well?
So if I just build on the CDF's initial response, during what's referred to as the high-risk weather season each year, we have troops across the ADF, speaking in terms of Army, around the country that are on a reduced notice to move, in other words, to be pre-positioned to respond. And there are also equipment, vehicles and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief stores, caches that are maintained specifically for that purpose.
Thank you. And just on indulgence, Chair, I want to say thank you for all of the efforts in North Queensland. As the Minister is fully aware in her other capacity, the it's going to take a long time to recover, but the outcome for communities in those areas, particularly in Ingham and Cardwell, would have been completely different without the support of the ADF. We're very grateful and thankful for the effort, the professionalism, and the community spirit that the personnel there showed. So if you can pass on our thanks, probably from the whole committee, I reckon, but thank you very much. It meant a lot to the community to have you there.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks for that, Senator. And yes, we do echo sentiments and also comments that you made. So thank you to everyone. Now, Senator Patterson, you've got the call.
Admiral Johnson, you said earlier that you're confident the ADF had the assets that it needed to do the surveillance that was necessary on this task group. You also acknowledged that the activities of this task group is unprecedented, and the Secretary said in his opening statement that it's a highly capable task group. But we've learnt this morning that because it was New Zealand that was monitoring the task group at the time of the live firing exercise, the notification to Australia was slower than it would have otherwise been if we were monitoring it. So was it a mistake not to have constant ADF surveillance of this task group?
Senator, I think it's important that we work with our partners in circumstances like the task group presented, that we remain uncertain to what the task group's direction might be. For a large period, it was moving towards New Zealand, and very appropriate to have a New Zealand frigate that was available to be part of our monitoring assessment to it. So I think it's really important that we are able to work with other countries, that we're able to bring together the strengths that we have. In my evidence to you, I also indicated we needed to be ready for a variety of potential different paths that the task group may have taken, and together we were putting in place the capabilities to be able to manage whatever pathway they took.
But, and no one would suggest we shouldn't be working with our New Zealand colleagues or any other close partners, as you've acknowledged, notification through defence channels of this live firing exercise was slower than it would have otherwise been had it been us maintaining that constant surveillance. What was more important for ADF assets to be doing than monitoring this task group?
What was most important is the Chinese providing appropriate notification of their intentions.
We're in agreement on that. We're in complete agreement on that. But I think we've learnt over the last week, if it wasn't already evident, we can't rely on them to do that. And that would be a dangerous assumption to start from, given that we can't rely on them on that. Why shouldn't the ADF have been providing our own constant surveillance?
Because we were very confident in the insights that we had on the movement of that task group, and we had our vessels and aircraft available to the extent that we needed it to be able to move in different directions. So it's a cooperative activity, Senator, that we were trying to achieve, and making sure that we remained as well positioned. Ships have set endurances. We need to make sure that we were husbanding or stewarding those capabilities well for that variety of different or pathways that we may have had to been dealing with.
Yes, but you also did say to me earlier that you were confident we had the assets that we needed to do the surveillance that was required, and you've acknowledged that notification through defence channels was significantly delayed. I mean, an hour and 3 minutes delayed from the first notification from a civilian airliner. Who knows, perhaps we would have picked it up at 9:30 had there been a P8 or an Australian frigate in the area.
I think you can't remove the responsibility of the task group for it. It's responsible for making sure the safety of civil or maritime activity in the area.
I will be the last to do that, Admiral Johnson, but I think you would agree that it's very clear, if it wasn't already, we can't rely on the PLAN to do that, can we?
I think in this circumstance, the conduct of their activities was clearly disruptive and unresponsible.
Okay. The financial review is very helpfully pieced together somewhat of a timeline from public reporting. I just want to see if we can flesh this out. So I'm going to run through it, and if you could correct anything that's wrong and add anything that you can as we go through. So the task group first commenced its firing exercise or window at 9:30. The Virgin pilot alerted Air Services Australia at 9:58. Air Services Australia warned planes flying across the Tasman to avoid the area at 10 a.m. Air Services Australia contacted JOC at 10:10. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you actually have a timeline there, and could you table it if you do?
I have parts of the timeline from the knowledge that we have, clearly not that from the civil aircraft or some of the other participants, but I have an indication of those key timings of, as we understand it, Senator, that I have, yes.
Can you table it?
I think I could provide it on notice to give it to you. I've got to be able to provide you with that summary.
Maybe just read it into the record then.
Yeah, or alternatively, you could read it on the record rather than me reading a timeline. You've got probably a more authoritative version. Why don't you commence from there?
So the timings that I have are at 9, and if I will use Australian Daylight Saving Time, if I might, throughout. 9:58, the Air Services was made aware by Virgin pilot. 10:10, Defence was notified by Air Services of the broadcast and the firing window that was part of the task group's security call. 11:01, Defence received advice from the New Zealand Defence Force that had been forwarded from the frigate that was operating in the area.
Okay, so JOC was notified at 10:10 by Air Services Australia. When were you first notified as CDF?
Of the JOC or the reporting?
Yeah.
I have to get that time. I don't have that in my chronology.
Do you have a memory of roughly when it was?
It was around midday.
Around midday,
yes.
Okay. Secretary,
Slightly before.
Secretary, when were you first notified?
I would have been notified around the same time as the CDF, Senator.
When was the Deputy Prime Minister first notified?
We had provided advice to the Deputy Prime Minister's office, initial advice at 11:30 in the morning.
So Defence notified the DPM's office before you were notified?
It would have been around the same time. So I'd said around midday.
Sure.
I would have.
I won't hold you to that exactly. If you can come back on notice with the precise time, that would be helpful. When was the Prime Minister first notified, or his office?
11:30 a.m.
Okay.
Sorry, that was the Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes, and I'm asking when was the Prime Minister notified?
I'm unable to provide that advice.
Why not?
Because I didn't communicate directly with the Prime Minister. Advice would have been
He's publicly said
we may not have
he has publicly said that you briefed him.
I did have a discussion with the Prime
When was
Minister,
that?
but that was in the afternoon.
Okay, what time was that?
It was around 4 p.m.
Okay. Did you brief any other ministers?
No.
Have you briefed NSC?
Well, we don't go to the content of NSC briefings, Senator.
Well, I wasn't asking for the content, just the timing.
Are.
So, but I think I heard the Admiral say he didn't brief NSC, so presumably NSC hasn't been convened on this matter, Minister.
Senator, we don't confirm the content of those meetings, nor do we confirm the timing of them.
Minister, that's a new convention because the Prime Minister has repeatedly publicly disclosed meetings of the National Security Cabinet, not just the timing but the content. For example, after the Adas Israel bombing, he disclosed that the NSC had met and that it was briefed by the AFP Commissioner and ASIO. He's done that on many occasions. So why does this convention apply now in this instance but not in those?
I'll take your question on notice, Senator.
Thank you. So just going back to the timeline, when was the Infrastructure Minister first notified?
Oh, Senator, I think those are questions for the infrastructure portfolio.
11:42.
Yes, I think that is right.
It is. So Catherine King knew and was briefed at 11:42 a.m. according to the evidence on Monday evening by Air Services Australia.
Well,
Although actually
Senator,
the AFR says that Catherine King was briefed at 11:20. Do you know?
Senator, it's not for officials in Defence or the ADF to provide advice about interactions between the Minister for Infrastructure and her portfolio.
It is if it's in their state of knowledge. I'm asking what they know.
Senator, I do not know what time other ministers were briefed, no.
And you have said you have not briefed any other ministers. Haven't briefed the Foreign Minister?
I have briefed the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister.
But the Foreign Minister was tasked to raise this on Australia's behalf with the Chinese Foreign Minister. Wouldn't a briefing from Defence be necessary to assist that?
We would have made sure the Department of Foreign Affairs had the material necessary to brief the Foreign Minister.
Okay, so they took charge of the briefing, to your knowledge.
But
you
they
can
would have
direct those
supported the
questions to
Foreign
Minister Wong tomorrow.
I look forward to that opportunity. Admiral Johnson, you alluded before to the differences in the way Australia would conduct an activity like this compared to the way that the PLAN has conducted it. One of the differences that you pointed out is that we would have given greater notice, 24 to 48 hours. Is there any other differences in the way that we conduct ourselves?
The differences would be observed by what occurred. So, Senator, if I understand, so we do not conduct high seas firings near civil air lanes, nor do we conduct them near civil maritime routes. So we made sure our firings are kept clear of those areas to avoid disruption to either military or commercial traffic that might be occurring. We also pre-warn, so we have a rule that applies inside our flight information region where we provide 48 hours notice for it through notices to mariners. If we are outside our flight information region, at least 4 hours before the commencement of a firing window, we will be providing warnings. But that goes hand in hand with our approach of operating outside of those areas that is likely to pose risks to aircraft or vessels.
So we've never conducted a live firing exercise in the South China Sea, for example, underneath a flight path of civilian airliners.
We've conducted firings in the South China Sea with partners in exercise areas. We do that with our firepower defence arrangement. We do it with other regional partners, but we do it as part of a constructed exercise that has the appropriate arrangements placed around it.
Were any of them underneath the flight path of civilian airliners?
Senator, I can't be equivocal about that over the many firings we've operated, as you know, for decades.
Yeah, in your state of knowledge.
But we would have applied our safety practices for every single one of them and to have complied in a way that we believe is best practice for those firings. So I'm not aware of any firing occurring that has caused commentary to come back about the nature of that firing for an Australian vessel.
Let me ask it this way. I think it was disclosed again to Senator McKenzie by Air Services Australia on Monday night that 49 commercial aircraft had to divert their route because of these live firing exercises. To your knowledge, have commercial airliners ever had to divert their route because of a firing exercise that Australia's conducted in the South China Sea, for example?
That may have been the case, but it would have been pre-warned, so that would have been a diversion that was managed with the appropriate time to do so. I'm not aware of an occasion where civil air traffic have had to, at very short notice, divert as a consequence of our firing.
Are there any strategic differences between the South China Sea and the Tasman Sea?
Sorry, Senator.
Are there any differences in the strategic environment in the South China Sea compared to the Tasman Sea?
In what context do you mean, Senator?
For example, are there any disputed islands or features in the Tasman Sea?
Not that I'm aware of, but clearly different environments between the two, but no disputed features that I'm aware of.
Any disputed international claims to territory in the Tasman Sea?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. Is the Tasman Sea a significant international shipping route to many countries?
It can be, depending on the ocean passageways that either move south of our country or north of our country, not all of which involve direct trade into or from Australia.
Compared to the volume of shipping activity in the South China Sea, how does the Tasman Sea rank?
It's less busy.
How much less busy? A little bit less busy, or...?
It's significantly less busy.
Yes, I would think so. So why does Australia conduct operations in the South China Sea?
So we conduct them in order to work with our partners in the region. We build capacity and confidence in the way we work together. Part of our activities are equally to uphold international law in those areas and to demonstrate the best practice in doing so.
And because it's a significant international waterway with significant trade routes which are related to our interest as a maritime trading nation, and as you say, to assert our perspective on international law in the area, and because it's strategically significant, do any of those factors apply to the Tasman Sea?
I think they're strategically significant to us as key sea lines of communication, but there are differences between the two regions, but the general principles equally apply in both.
Yes. Is the Tasman Sea strategically significant for China?
You need to ask the Chinese that, Senator.
How could the Tasman Sea? How could the Tasman Sea be strategically significant to China? For what reason would it be strategically significant to China?
Senator, if I could add,
please.
I think the Chinese are signalling, they are practising and rehearsing, and they are collecting.
Mm-hmm. And why would they have an interest in doing that in this remote part of the world where there are no disputes in relation to international law, where there are no disputed features, where it is not a significant trading route for them or for anyone else other than us? What's the purpose of doing it so far south in the Tasman Sea?
I think China's made clear that it is growing a blue water naval capability. It's claiming certainly regional and global interests as a maritime power, and I expect that they will wish to continue to be present in an increasing number of international waterways in the years ahead.
So, Admiral, do you think it's fair or reasonable to compare the way Australia conducts ourselves in the South China Sea and the way that the PLAN has conducted themselves in the Tasman Sea?
Are you specifically referring to the high seas firing?
Yes.
But I think what we have seen is, and I think I've characterised that it is clearly disruptive to civil air traffic, as we've seen. It doesn't demonstrate the best practice that we would expect from mariners operating in that region. So it sure falls short of the standard that we apply to ourselves, and in that sense it was irresponsible.
Yes, so you wouldn't characterise our behaviour in the South China Sea as irresponsible or unprofessional or disruptive or reckless or any of those things?
No, I think we operate in a manner that is entirely consistent with international law and the high standards of a professional military force, which is what the ADF is.
So it's not a fair comparison between the recent activities of the PLAN in relation to these live firing exercises and Australia's conduct in the South China Sea or elsewhere?
No.
No. Well, the Prime Minister has repeatedly publicly compared them. He's drawn an equivalence between them. He says, and I quote, "Australia conducts exercises in the South China Sea and in the region, in international waters and international airspace." And he even went on to say that the location of the South China Sea is hinted at in its name. Why do you think the Prime Minister has made this comparison if it's not a fair one?
Senator, the government has been incredibly clear that we will continue to exercise our rights to operate in international waters, and you see that reflected in statements from the Prime Minister down. The Prime Minister has also made the straightforward observation, as have other ministers, that we respect the right of others to exercise freedom of navigation and oversight in international waters and airspace. At the same time, we are disappointed in the particular notification around this live fire exercise. We've made it really clear that the benchmark that we would apply is a best practice benchmark, giving advance notice, giving the best possible opportunity for people to make accommodations, to manage safety. We're clear that we do not think this meets the standards of best practice, and we've raised that with China, as has been made publicly known.
Minister, aren't we entitled to expect better from our comprehensive strategic partner?
I think we've been very clear about the approach here. We do think that this could have been handled better, and we've raised those concerns with China directly, including through the Foreign Minister.
The government's pursuing a foreign policy of stabilising relations with China. Is this evidence of stabilisation?
From the very beginning of our government's tenure, we've been clear that this is an important and challenging relationship. Our approach to it is to be steady, to be consistent, to raise our concerns and our interests in a very predictable and consistent way, and that's what you are seeing here. Whether it's in relation to the unprofessional and unsafe interaction, which we haven't discussed in any detail this morning, or whether it's in relation to the live fire exercise, we use every opportunity to raise these issues directly with counterparts at the appropriate level.
Okay, I just want to go back to this timeliness of notifications. We've got the transcript from Senate estimates on Monday from Services Australia, and they did confirm that the department informed the Minister for Infrastructure's office at 11:20. So it seems that the Minister for Infrastructure was briefed before the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister and before you were briefed. But doesn't this indicate a pretty fundamental breakdown in our reporting system?
Senator, this was principally an air safety matter. So having that rapid communication flow, as we've described, from the aircraft through to air services and the Minister, is a reflection of it was an air safety matter. And so I think that pathway is the important pathway, while the defence reporting was being run concurrent with it. But you're describing a matter of minutes, not a more significant differentiation in time between the two.
I think most Australians would expect, if a foreign military is conducting activities in our region, that the first person to know about it would be the Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, not the Infrastructure Minister. I mean, if God forbid, conflict were to break out in our region, should we call Catherine King to ask what's going on first before we call Richard Marles?
But Senator, you're referring to events that were conducted on the high seas, consistent with international law, less than best practice as we have described, but to draw an equivalence to a different set of circumstances where our national security is at risk is not a reasonable equivalence of the two events.
It's not a national security issue if there's a live firing exercise by the PLAN in our region?
That we're not notified about?
I said that our national security is at risk.
It's not a risk to our national security that Australian civilians in aircraft flying to New Zealand have to divert with no notice because a live firing exercise being conducted by a foreign military?
I think that it is a significant event and clearly was disruptive to civil air services, but I'm not aware of any characterisation that indicated those aircraft were at immediate risk.
Okay, so just to confirm for the record, there was no prior notification from the PLAN or the Chinese government prior to this live firing exercise on Friday?
That's correct.
Nor on Saturday?
Correct.
In the second live firing incident. It was also the New Zealand military that was monitoring the second live firing incident?
That's right.
And how was the timeliness of that notification?
Last minute.
Jonathan, you got to go. 11:50. Senator Rear Admiral Jonathan Early, Head of Military Strategic Commitments. We received advice at approximately 11:50 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, advice from the New Zealand Defence Force, that they'd overheard a broadcast on open-air channels of the PLA task group to conduct a high seas firing over the period of 1200 to 1500 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time.
So just to be clear, when did the live firing exercise take place?
That was the window. We did receive advice. That particular firing, the New Zealand Defence Force did observe.
Yes.
And
so the firing was at 11:50? Or the notification?
That's when we received the report.
Yep.
So that was 11:50 for the window that they broadcast between 12 and 1500.
Yep. And the actual live firing occurred at?
At 13:08 or 1:08.
Yep.
Okay. And there, again, were no Australian assets in the area?
It was being monitored by the New Zealand frigate.
Okay. So when were you notified, CDF?
Senator, I don't have that specific timeline available to me.
Okay. When was the Deputy Prime Minister notified?
The Deputy Prime Minister was notified, or the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister was notified at 1300.
At 1300, so prior to the live firing exercise itself, but an hour and a half roughly after the report came in. That's my maths right there.
Well, an hour and
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. When was the Prime Minister notified about this second live firing exercise?
I can't answer that question, Senator. I'm not privy to that.
Admiral, did you brief the Prime Minister in relation to the second live firing
No,
incident?
I did not.
Do we know if anyone did?
I know the Prime Minister has been regularly updated, but I don't have that.
By whom?
The Prime Minister is briefed by a range of different personnel, and I believe this was canvassed. These issues were canvassed on Monday, PM&C estimates.
Okay, well then, do you know the answer, Minister?
I'll take that on notice, Senator, but these questions are best directed to the Prime Minister's department and his representative in estimates, and that occurred on Monday.
Well, all right, we'll need to move the call along. Now, Senator Rennick, I'll give you the call, and then Senator SHOEBRIDGE. Senator Rennick.
Hi guys, I've got two questions. The first one is a very simple one. Will you lift the requirement for soldiers to have a COVID vaccine before they go overseas or before they need to enter the military? I know the AFP have dropped theirs and most other organisations have dropped theirs. Is that something the military is prepared to do?
Senator, we'll just change the officials out to be in a position to answer your question.
Well, just before you go, I'll put the second one to you as well, just so you don't come back again, is regarding enlistment. So I've got a number of emails. I've raised this before again in defence about the difficulty Australians are having in regards to enlisting into the military, particularly young people. I've got a number of emails here from military families who cannot get their sons into the military. I'll read one email. My son Nathan has been attempting to join the Australian Army as an enlisted soldier for the last 10 months. This process has been amazingly slow and inefficient, with documents being requested multiple times, interviews being cancelled and moved, my son being asked back for multiple interviews and finally being rejected for the ADF gap year. I'll just read the next part. I think he was told to join Toastmasters to work on his communication. Nathan is a sound communicator, engaging in both drama and writing at school, in addition to music and football. He also took on the lead role in his school's high school musical performance, while still volunteering to assist in set up and instruction. I guess my point is, why are you going to the extent for people who clearly, young Australian men and women, who are clearly good communicators, fit and able-bodied, why are you making it so difficult for them to join the military?
Senator, I can't talk to the particular circumstances.
No, I'm not asking you to join the
individuals, but clearly we need to grow the military to meet our targets. We are working on that recruiting system to ensure that can be the case. We've been on the public record that the recruiting system has not been delivering the outcome that we have needed, and we have been working to address those areas in its performance that have been most impacting the recruiting rates. But I will ask the specialist to talk to you more broadly.
Senator Rennick, Lieutenant General Natasha Fox, Chief of Personnel. In relation to the individual, there are many reasons that people are unable to join the military, and depending on the role that they were applying for, there may have been requirements for additional information. For instance, if it was an aviation role, there's a requirement for additional testing in and around medical requirements to perform aviation roles. And
this wasn't an aviation role, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if gap year does have some aviation role.
Right.
So in terms of the numbers of people recruiting, we've apologised in the past in terms of it is too slow, but we're working on measures to address the velocity in the pipeline for people to join the ADF. Depending on the role, sometimes there are more people who want the role than actually targets available for the particular role linked to the design of the Australian Defence Force. So there are multiple aspects that impact a person's journey through Defence Force recruiting, and we're working with our partner Adecco in relation to speeding up that time frame. In fact, it's a focus of work that we're undertaking this year in particular about that velocity. CDF mentioned in his opening statement The volume of people that are applying to join the ADF is significant, and in fact, for the first time in the forecast to recruit to the permanent force this year, we will exceed numbers that we haven't recruited since the early 2000s.
Okay, great. I mean, I guess, I always thought the military was a place where you go, if people went to knock them into shape, but it seems to me there's this attitude that they've got to sort themselves out before they join. And, from what I hear, what I read, I don't pretend to be an expert on defence matters, is that there is a shortage in recruitment. You're struggling to recruit. So I just don't understand why you'd be making it harder for children, especially children of military families with military backgrounds, to actually join up.
Without understanding the specifics, Senator Rennick, I can't tell you where they...
No, I accept that. I mean, and this... these aren't, I'm surprised at how many emails I get because I'm not out there in the military space because, I didn't serve in the military, so I'm not,
There are a number of requirements to join the military. I wouldn't say you join to knock people into shape. Given the role that the Australian Defence Force performs, we need to make sure that the people who do join the military are able to be employed and deployed in environments where they can be perform their role in a safe manner, both for themselves but also for their teammates. So we do take that enlistment criteria quite seriously in terms of how we assess people to join. We assess people based on their aptitude, their potential to undertake roles, their medical conditions, their psychological conditions, and criminal and background checks to ensure that the behaviours, as well as actually the ability to achieve a security clearance, so that the Australian Defence Force is able to employ the capabilities and our roles as required.
Okay, thank you. Just one on the vaccine. If someone was going to give me a response on that.
Senator Rear Admiral Sonia Bennett, Surgeon General, Defence Force. So the nature and circumstances of deployment mean access to healthcare is not readily available. So health has a number of requirements for individual readiness for deployment. Vaccination is one of those for a range of vaccines, and you've asked specifically about COVID. Since the implementation of the COVID vaccination program, Defence has followed the ATAGI advice on this, the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, and continues to stay up to date. That's changed as recently as just requiring one dose for a primary course, and then consideration of a booster once every 12 years for otherwise fit and healthy young people. Whilst it's we have a vaccination schedule that is a requirement for readiness, there are opportunity, and we have individuals, it's still a voluntary process, so we do have individuals who refuse the vaccine. In those circumstances, we would initially have a health conversation with them first to encourage them to be vaccinated for health reasons. Then there is an option. They are technically not fit to deploy, but there's also remain options for Command to issue waivers should they see that there are circumstances that the benefit of that individual deploying outweighs the risk, and that would be things like the geographical area, the nature of deployment, whether there's a COVID surge happening in that area.
I'll just finish with this. Thanks, Chair. I've got two issues with that. First of all, the ATAGI advice is young people don't need to get the vaccine. And number two, another story of a young guy that's in the military can't deploy was that he was told by his officers that it stops transmission. Well, that's not the case at all. We had 10 million Australians catch COVID in the first 9 months after we opened up, so it's not stopping transmission. So I'm not sure where your officers and your leaders in the military are getting their advice from, but that is not correct. So I would ask you to go back and read the ATAGI advice again, and take into consideration the number of people who have been injured by the vaccine as well. So plenty of young people who've all got strong immune systems can survive. I'm not talking about the other vaccines, I'm talking about this one in particular.
Yes, so Senator Rennick, in 2024 ATAGI advice, so unless they've issued more recent advice, does recommend one vaccine as a primary course for people over the age of 18 who are otherwise fit and healthy. So I think maybe it depends on whether you consider a recommendation versus a mandate. and ask those people to consider a vaccine every 12 months. And that consideration will be based on whether we've got COVID circulating in the community, as we did as recently as late last year.
Yeah.
I agree with you on transmission, that the nature of that has changed over time. Certainly during the pandemic, there was an element of transmission reduction that occurred when people were initially vaccinated. Less important now. It's more about protecting the individual and the capability on deployment that vaccination is required for.
But here's the thing, you're saying one dose. The variants, there's new variants all the time. So that dose from 3 years ago is now out of date. And yet, say if you got one dose 3 years ago, you're entitled to go overseas, but you're actually out of date. And if you actually read the report, the non-clinical report, anyone that's had COVID has 100% CD4 T-cell protection and 70% CD8 T-cell protection. So, you know, why it's just an unnecessary thing. Even other agencies like the AFP have dropped this requirement. So it just seems to me it's an unnecessary blockage, especially when we're trying to recruit more people into the military.
All right. Thanks a lot, Senator
Okay.
Rennick.
Thanks,
Now,
Chair. I'll
Senator
leave it at
SHOEBRIDGE.
Thanks, Chair. We're going to morning tea in 8 minutes, is that right?
Sorry?
We're going to morning tea in 8 minutes?
We are, but I'll give you an extra 2. Give you a 10 and then we'll break.
The Admiral Johnson, there was a published tribunal decision from the Administrative Review Tribunal on the 20th of February in which the tribunal agreed with ASIO's assessment to remove a security clearance, I think it was negative vetting 2, from an officer who was anonymised as HWMW. You aware of that?
I am, sir.
The ASIO and the tribunal both found that HWMW, and I'll quote here, demonstrated a higher level of loyalty to Israel than to the Australian government, and both found that in ASIO's assessment there are real concerns about the applicant's loyalty to Australia, his susceptibility to foreign influence and his compliance with security holder obligations which pose a risk to security. Those concerns arose over a series of interviews that were undertaken by ASIO. My first question is when did HWMW have the security clearance removed or suspended?
Senator Celia Perkins, Deputy Secretary, Security and Estate. Thank you for your questions. I would, in the first instance, make the point that the Administrative Review Tribunal decision that you're referring to is an affirmation or an upholding of an ASIO adverse security assessment. The matters in that decision that was published are important. I would echo the comments by the Director-General of Security, Mike Burgess, last night, that we won't speak to the specifics of the case beyond what is in the public decision, the published decision of the ART. So I'm reluctant to speak to individual vetting cases that are usually rich and fulsome, but we can canvass what is in that report of the ASIO security assessment decision. So on the face of the decision, HWMW retained the negative vetting security clearance access to top secret documents until the conclusion of the process. That's what the decision says. The decision says that, yes. Yeah. Given the very real concerns that were raised, including not telling the truth about the training that happened in Israel, which was known well in advance of the final decision, including admitting to having breached the confidentiality requirements of the interview with ASIO and speaking to the head of CSG in Sydney. These were all known and admitted to in the course of the investigation, yet HWMW retained access to top secret documents notwithstanding that.
Is that usual practice? That somebody retains access to top secret even if those levels of concerns are admitted and known?
Senator, as Mr Burgess discussed with you last night, he's not in a position to share the ins and outs of the investigation. I can talk to the process. What that ART published decision refers to is an ASIO security assessment. In the process, at various points in security clearance processes or reviews, we refer cases to ASIO. That's a standard part of various clearances. ASIO undertake a security assessment. They then refer back to the Department of Defence outcomes, and then we take action on the basis of ASIO's security assessments, in this case an adverse security assessment.
Well, I'll just read again from ASIO's submission, which was endorsed by the Tribunal. It was that in ASIO's assessment, there are real concerns about the applicant's loyalty to Australia. Admiral Johnson, is HWMW still a member of the ADF?
I'll get the Chief of Army to respond.
Senator, the member is in the inactive reserve pending administrative action.
So still a member of the ADF?
Yes, that's correct.
What does it take to have somebody removed from the ADF? We have ASIO finding that there are real concerns about this person's loyalty to Australia. Security clearance removed. There's a finding that they've demonstrated a higher level of loyalty to a foreign government than to Australia, and yet this person is still a member of the ADF.
Senator,
is that normal?
Senator, may I make a number of points, and then I will pass to Chief of Army to provide any further information. But this is an independent process. It is one that is completed by ASIO and security, and as you've observed, has been recently heard in the ART. We would not ordinarily canvass individual personnel, the circumstances of individual personnel in this forum. Now, you have asked some questions which go to general processes, and of course officials can talk to you about the general approach, but there are some limitations on what we can and should say about individual members of the ADF, present or former.
Lieutenant General.
Thanks, Senator. What I would offer to you is that the members' status in terms of their service, as they've been moved from one service category to another. The service category is best described as inactive. So that's the action that has been taken thus far in relation to the advice that we've been provided.
The tribunal findings and also ASIO's assessment and the admission of HWMW all make it clear that the training that HWMW attended and failed to disclose in Israel with the CSG group in Israel left them incredibly susceptible to recruitment by Mossad. Has there been a review undertaken by the ADF of any other ADF members that have undertaken that same or similar training by CSG that makes them incredibly susceptible to recruitment by a foreign government?
Senator, I think we can take that question on notice. I've provided you with some early advice that these security questions, there are reasons we don't discuss individual matters, there are also reasons we don't discuss detailed questions of national security. We'll take that on notice and see what information can responsibly be provided to you.
Well, Minister, this is a publicly released decision which raises incredibly real concerns about, in this case, the potential recruitment by a member of the ADF by a foreign government's security agencies, and that exposure happened at training that occurs in a foreign nation. My question to the Chief of Defence Force is, first of all, have you read the judgment, Admiral Johnson?
I'm aware of the judgment. No, I have not read it.
Have you received a briefing on the judgment?
I'm aware of the judgment and the circumstances, Senator.
Ensuring that the ADF's loyalty and the members of the ADF's loyalty, their highest loyalty is to Australia, I would have thought is something that you would take as incredibly serious.
Yes.
And kind of non-negotiable. That would be non-negotiable, wouldn't it? The members of the ADF, their highest loyalty is to Australia rather than any other country.
Yes, Senator. They serve the country of whose uniform they wear.
Yep. Well, their highest loyalty is to Australia. You don't wish to adopt that?
But, Senator, we have dual citizens in our country. You're asking me for a comparator of them. We have clear expectations on anyone who is in the Australian Defence Force to comply with our law and the function and role that they perform.
All right. So,
last question.
Given the concerns that this training in Israel was in circumstances where there was a high chance of persons participating in it are recruited by a foreign government, and in this case a foreign government's intelligence services, have you tasked the ADF with doing a review of which other ADF personnel have done this same training?
Senator, you asked that question previously and I indicated that we would take it on notice, noting its intersection with a range of other national security issues and the role that ASIO plays in managing those on behalf of the Australian Government.
All right. On that note, we're now going to break for 10 minutes and we'll be back after morning tea. Thanks, everyone.